I never expected to stand in a lawyer's office at 28, watching my family's faces transform from smug certainty to shocked disbelief as grandfather's will was read. For years, my parents had convinced everyone, including me, that my brother Ethan deserved the lion's share of any family inheritance. He has the proper education, they'd say. He understands business. But as Mr. Harrington read the final clause of grandfather's letter, my mother dropped her designer handbag, my father's face turned ashen, and my brother's confident smile vanished. That moment changed everything, not just our financial futures, but the very foundation of our family dynamic. The inheritance wasn't just about money, it was about truth, recognition, and a grandfather who had been quietly watching all along. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The text message from my mother arrived during my lunch break at the community center where I worked. Grandfather James passed this morning. Funeral Saturday at Oakwood Memorial. Wear something appropriate. No, I'm sorry, Olivia. No acknowledgement that I'd spent every Sunday afternoon for the past 5 years reading to him when everyone else was too busy. Just instructions and judgment wrapped in the clinical notification of his death. I set my phone down on my desk, hands trembling slightly as I stared out the window at the children playing in the yard. As the community center's program director, I was supposed to be reviewing grant applications, but now all I could think about was grandfather's empty chair by the bay window of his study, the shelf of books we'd been working through, the tin of butterscotch candies he always kept for my visits. You doing okay, Liv? Marcos, my colleague, leaned against my doorframe, concern etched in his features. My grandfather died, I said, the words feeling strange in my mouth. I'd known it was coming. The doctors had been clear about the heart failure, but the reality of his absence still felt unreal. I'm so sorry, were you close? I considered the question. Were we close? In the traditional sense of family gatherings and shared holidays, no. My parents had always kept those occasions focused on Ethan, his achievements, his needs. Grandfather would sit quietly at the end of the table, observing more than participating. But our Sunday afternoons had been different. Just the two of us sharing stories and ideas. He'd listened to my work at the center with genuine interest, something no one else in my family had ever shown. Yes, I finally answered. In our own way, we were. When I arrived home that evening to my modest apartment above Mrs. Galloway's garage, I pulled out the box of photographs I kept under my bed. There weren't many of grandfather and me together. My mother always positioned Ethan front and center, in family photos, with me typically relegated to the edges if included at all. But there was one, taken 3 years ago at grandfather's 80th birthday. While the official family portrait featured Ethan presenting grandfather with an expensive watch, purchased with my parents' money, though that detail was conveniently omitted from the story, this candid shot captured a moment no one else had noticed. In it, grandfather and I sat in matching chairs by the fireplace, both of us laughing at something now forgotten. Our postures mirrored each other, heads tilted slightly, hands gesturing in the same way. My cousin Jessica had captured it by accident and given me the print afterward. You two are definitely related, she'd said. I've never seen Uncle James laugh like that with anyone else. I traced the outline of his face in the photograph. James Montgomery had built Montgomery Shipping from nothing, turning a single cargo boat into a regional shipping empire through sheer determination and strategic thinking. Even into his 80s, he'd maintained a sharp mind and an active interest in the business, though he'd officially turned operations over to my father 15 years ago. Or rather, he'd turned operations over with the understanding that my father would eventually pass leadership to Ethan, the golden child, the business, school graduate, the son who embodied all my parents' ambitions. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. Ethan's name flashed on the screen. "Hello?" I answered, already tensing for whatever criticism or demand might follow. "Olivia." My brother's voice sounded strained. "Have you spoken to Mom and Dad?" "Just got a text about the funeral." "Right." He paused. "I'm handling the arrangements. Dad's not. He's taking it hard." I bit back a retort about how our father had barely visited grandfather in the past year, always claiming to be too busy with meetings or golf games. "I'm sure he is," I said instead. "There's a meeting with grandfather's lawyer on Monday after the funeral. You need to be there." This surprised me. I'd assumed any legal matters would be handled by my father and Ethan, as they managed all other family business affairs. "Why?" I asked. Apparently, grandfather was very specific that all family members needed to be present for the reading of the will. That includes you. The way he said "includes you" carried the usual subtext, that my inclusion was an inconvenience, an afterthought, a courtesy extended to someone who didn't really matter in the important affairs of the Montgomery family. "I'll be there," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "Don't be late." "And Olivia?" "Wear something professional. Mr. Harrington is a serious attorney, not one of your community center fundraisers." Before I could respond, he'd hung up. I set the phone down and returned to the photograph, studying grandfather's face. Had he insisted on my presence at the will reading? Why would that matter to him? I was the family disappointment. The granddaughter who'd rejected a business degree to study social work, who chose a nonprofit salary over a position at Montgomery Shipping, who lived in a garage apartment instead of the upscale condos my parents had offered to subsidize if I'd come to my senses and joined the family business. Saturday arrived with appropriately somber weather. Gray skies and a light drizzle that turned the cemetery's manicured lawns slick and shiny. I stood slightly apart from my family during the service, listening as the pastor spoke about grandfather's business acumen, his contributions to the community, his legacy as seen through his son and grandson. No mention of his love of literature, his quiet philanthropy to causes he never publicized, or his Sunday afternoons with his granddaughter. Those parts of him remained invisible to everyone but me. At the reception afterward, held at my parents' sprawling Tudor home in Oak Ridge Estates, I moved through the rooms like a ghost. Business associates shook my father's hand and patted Ethan's shoulder, offering condolences and reminiscing about deals made and opportunities seized. My mother presided over the catering staff with military precision, ensuring the past hors d'oeuvres and wine service met her exacting standards. No one approached me or seemed to notice my presence, which was nothing new. I found myself in grandfather's study, kept exactly as it had been in his house before he moved into my parents' home for his final year. The books we'd read together lined the shelves. Melville, Steinbeck, Woolf, Angelo. He'd loved American literature especially, finding in it echoes of his own journey from modest beginnings to success. "What are you doing in here?" I turned to find my mother in the doorway, a flute of champagne in her manicured hand. "Just remembering," I said. She surveyed the room with a critical eye. "We'll need to clear all this out. Ethan wants to use this space as a home office when he takes over as CEO next month." The casual way she announced this, a major family business decision I was hearing about for the first time, was typical. Information was shared with me only when necessary, and often as an afterthought. "Grandfather only died 2 days ago," I said quietly. "Maybe we could wait before dividing up his belongings." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Don't be sentimental, Olivia. It doesn't accomplish anything. Your grandfather was a businessman first and foremost. He would expect us to be practical." Would he, though? The grandfather I knew had read poetry with me, had discussed philosophy and ethics, had valued things beyond balance sheets and profit margins. But that version of James Montgomery seemed unknown to the rest of my family. "Of course," I conceded. knowing from long experience that disagreeing would only lead to a lecture about my impractical nature and poor judgment. "By the way," she added, "I hope you're not expecting anything significant from the will reading. Your grandfather understood where the family priorities needed to be." The presumption in her statement stung, though I'd never had any expectations about inheriting anything substantial. My relationship with grandfather hadn't been about money. "I'm not expecting anything," I assured her. "Good." She nodded, satisfied. "Then you won't be disappointed. I've already discussed with your father that anything small that comes your way should be invested properly. We can have Ethan manage it for you." Of course they had already discussed this. Of course they'd already decided how to manage money I didn't even know if I would receive. Of course they assumed I was incapable of making my own financial decisions. "I'll keep that in mind," I said neutrally. Sunday passed quietly. I spent it at my apartment, looking through the books grandfather had given me over the years, each with a thoughtful inscription about why he'd selected it for me. My favorite was his worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, in which he'd written, "To Olivia, who, like Atticus, understands that courage isn't a man with a gun, but knowing you're licked before you begin but beginning anyway. Your heart is your greatest strength. Love, grandfather." Monday morning arrived with a knot in my stomach. I dressed carefully in a charcoal gray suit, one of the few professional outfits I owned, purchased for grant presentations and donor meetings. It wasn't as expensive as anything my mother would wear, but it was appropriate and well-tailored. Harrington and Associates occupied a stately brick building downtown, its offices decorated with the understated elegance that old money law firms preferred. The conference room where we gathered featured a polished mahogany table, leather chairs, and walls lined with law books that looked both impressive and untouched. My parents arrived exactly 5 minutes before the scheduled time, my mother in a black St. John suit, my father in bespoke navy. Ethan followed in a nearly identical suit, though his tie featured the Montgomery shipping logo subtly woven into the pattern. They acknowledged me with brief nods before taking seats opposite me at the table. Mr. Harrington entered precisely at 10 a.m., a slender man in his 60s with wire-rimmed glasses and a formal demeanor that matched the surroundings. "Good morning," he said, setting his briefcase on the table. "Thank you all for being here. As you know, I served as James Montgomery's personal attorney for over 30 years. He was very specific about his wishes regarding his estate. He removed several documents from his briefcase, arranging them methodically before him. Before I begin the formal reading, I must note that James left strict instructions that all family members must be present, and that his will must be read in its entirety before any discussion." He glanced meaningfully at my father, who had a reputation for interrupting. My father nodded impatiently. "We understand, Harold. Please proceed." As Mr. Harrington began reading, I studied my family's faces. My mother sat perfectly poised, her expression revealing nothing. My father leaned forward slightly, his attention focused on the documents. Ethan maintained what he believed to be his business face, serious with a hint of confidence, the expression he'd practiced in mirrors since business school. The initial bequests were unsurprising. Various charitable organizations received donations. Longtime employees were remembered with modest but generous gifts. Family heirlooms were distributed mainly to my father, with instructions to preserve them for future generations. Then Mr. Harrington paused, taking a sip of water before continuing. "Now, regarding the primary assets, Montgomery Shipping and all associated holdings, as well as James Montgomery's personal investment portfolio and real estate." The air in the room seemed to thicken. This was what everyone had been waiting for, the disposition of grandfather's considerable fortune. My father straightened in his chair. Ethan adjusted his Montgomery shipping tie. Even my mother's perfect posture became slightly more rigid. I prepared myself to hear what we all expected, that everything substantial would go to my father and Ethan, the continuation of the Montgomery business legacy through the male line. What I didn't prepare for was what came next. James Montgomery has established the Montgomery Family Trust to be divided as follows. Mr. Harrington continued, his voice betraying no emotion. 50% of all business assets, investments, and properties are hereby bequeathed to his granddaughter, Olivia Montgomery. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The conference room fell utterly silent. I could hear the antique grandfather clock in the corner ticking away seconds that seemed to stretch into minutes. My mind struggled to process what I'd just heard. 50% of everything? To me? My mother recovered first, her perfectly composed facade cracking. There must be some mistake, she said, her voice higher than normal. Harold, surely James, didn't intend? Mr. Harrington held up a hand. If I may continue, Mrs. Montgomery. I'm required to read the will in its entirety before any discussion. My father's face had turned an alarming shade of red. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, seeming to remember that interruptions weren't permitted. Ethan stared at the table, his knuckles white where he gripped the armrests of his chair. The remaining 50%, Mr. Harrington continued, adjusting his glasses, is to be divided as follows. 25% to Robert Montgomery, with the stipulation that he serve in an advisory capacity only, with no executive decision-making. Authority at Montgomery Shipping. My father made a strangled sound. No executive authority. In the company he'd been running for 15 years. The final 25% is bequeathed to Ethan Montgomery, with the stipulation that he may not serve as CEO until he has completed a minimum of 5 years working in operational roles within the company, beginning at entry level. Ethan's head snapped up, his expression a mixture of shock and outrage. Entry level? I have an MBA from Wharton. Mr. Harrington again held up his hand. Please, Mr. Montgomery, there's more. He turned the page and continued reading. Additionally, James Montgomery has left a personal letter to be read at this time, addressed to his family. From his briefcase, Mr. Harrington removed an envelope sealed with the Montgomery Shipping logo in wax. With deliberate movements, he broke the seal and unfolded several handwritten pages. In my own words, he began reading, to be shared only upon my death, when I no longer need to maintain peace at family gatherings. I nearly gasped at grandfather's characteristic dry humor, so unexpected in this formal setting. Mr. Harrington's lips twitched slightly before he continued. To my family. If you are hearing this, then I have finally departed this world, hopefully having lived long enough to see if my suspicions about each of you proved correct or incorrect. I have watched, I have listened, and I have made my decisions accordingly. To my son Robert, you have successfully maintained the business I built, but you have forgotten why I built it. Montgomery Shipping was never meant to be about prestige or power, but about creating something of lasting value and providing opportunities for others. Your focus on appearances over substance, on short-term profits over long-term stability, and on status over service has been disappointing to witness. Moreover, your treatment of your daughter has revealed a character flaw I had hoped you would outgrow. You have consistently devalued Olivia's contributions, dismissed her intellect, and prioritized Ethan's ambitions regardless of merit. This was never about protecting the business legacy. It was about your own insecurity and narrow definition of success. To my daughter-in-law Diane, you have brought elegance and social connections to the Montgomery name, but at the cost of authenticity and warmth. Your orchestration of family dynamics to maintain appearances rather than nurture relationships has created a household of performance rather than genuine connection. Your dismissal of Olivia's chosen path reflects your prioritization of status over substance, and your manipulation of Ethan has done him no favors in preparing him for the real world. To my grandson Ethan, you have been given every advantage: education, connections, mentorship, and constant praise. Yet in our private conversations, you have revealed a startling lack of understanding about the actual operations of Montgomery Shipping. Your knowledge is theoretical, your experience minimal, and your sense of entitlement concerning. Your belief that executive leadership should be yours by birthright rather than earned through demonstrated capability is precisely what I worked all my life to avoid instilling in my descendants. And finally, to my granddaughter Olivia, you alone have demonstrated the qualities I valued most: integrity, empathy, critical thinking, and moral courage. Your choice to forge your own path despite constant pressure shows a strength of character that cannot be taught in any business school. Your work at the community center, which your family dismisses as beneath your potential, reflects the very values upon which I built Montgomery Shipping: service to others, commitment to community, and recognition of human dignity regardless of status. Our Sunday afternoons together have been among my greatest joys in recent years. While others sought my company for business advice or family obligation, you sought genuine connection. You asked about the person behind the business, and in doing so, you demonstrated the most important quality a leader can possess: the ability to see the humanity in others. My division of assets reflects not sentimentality, but strategic vision. Olivia's perspective is precisely what Montgomery Shipping needs to thrive in the future. Her understanding of community needs, her ethical framework, and her ability to connect with people from all walks of life are invaluable assets in an increasingly complex global business environment. This arrangement also reflects my belief that true leadership must be earned through demonstrated capability, not conferred by birth or credential. Ethan must prove himself through actual work experience, not theoretical knowledge. Robert must step back from control to serve as mentor rather than monarch. I have instructed my attorney, Harold Harrington, to provide guidance during this transition. A separate document outlines the governance structure that will be implemented, including the formation of a board of directors that will include non-family members with relevant expertise. I recognize that this decision will create shock, anger, and resistance. I am at peace with that consequence. Montgomery Shipping was built to last beyond any individual's ego, including my own. These provisions ensure its continuation as a business that creates value while honoring values. With love and clear-eyed assessment, James Montgomery. As Mr. Harrington folded the letter, the silence in the room grew oppressive. I felt as though I were underwater. Sounds muffled and movements slowed. The letter had been so much more than instructions about money and assets. It had been grandfather's final, honest assessment of his family, the things he'd observed but never said during family gatherings where harmony was maintained through careful avoidance of truth. My father was the first to break the silence. "This is outrageous," he sputtered, his face now purple with rage. "I've run that company for 15 years. Olivia knows nothing about shipping, about business, about any of it." "Dad," I began, but he cut me off with a dismissive gesture. "Not now, Olivia. Harold, there must be some way to contest this." James was clearly not in his right mind toward the end. The heart medication, the pain management, they affected his judgment. Mr. Harrington's expression remained professionally neutral. "I can assure you, Robert, that James was of completely sound mind when he made these arrangements. In fact, this will was created and signed 3 years ago, with annual reviews and confirmations, the most recent being just 2 months ago. He was meticulously thorough in establishing his competency." 3 years? My mother's voice was faint. "He's been planning this for 3 years?" "James began reconsidering his estate plans approximately 5 years ago," Mr. Harrington confirmed. "He made his final decisions after considerable thought and observation. 5 years ago, when I had returned from graduate school and begun my work at the community center, when I had started visiting grandfather every Sunday while the rest of the family attended the country club or networked at charity galas. 5 years of quiet conversations, of shared books, of genuine interest in each other's thoughts and experiences. 5 years during which I'd assumed grandfather was simply enjoying his retirement while the important family members handled business matters. "This isn't right," Ethan finally spoke, his voice tight. "I've been preparing my whole life to run Montgomery Shipping. I have the education, the connections, the vision, and now I'm supposed to start at entry level, filing paperwork and answering phones? It's insulting." "Perhaps that's precisely why grandfather made that stipulation," I said quietly. "Because understanding every level of the business operations might be more valuable than any theory learned in business school." Ethan glared at me. "Oh, that's rich coming from you. What do you know about running a shipping company? You spend your days making macaroni art with underprivileged kids." The dismissive characterization of my work, developing programs that provided essential services to vulnerable community members, was typical of how my family viewed my career. But for the first time, I didn't feel diminished by their assessment. Grandfather's letter had confirmed what I'd always hoped but never quite believed: that my choices had value, that my perspective mattered, that my path was not a disappointment, but a different kind of success. "Actually," I replied, meeting his gaze steadily, "I spend my days managing a staff of 15, balancing budgets with minimal resources, developing strategic partnerships, navigating complex regulatory requirements, and measuring outcomes. The skills aren't so different, just the context and the compensation." My mother huffed in disbelief. "This is hardly the time for your social justice speech, Olivia. We have a serious situation to address." "Indeed we do, Mr. Harrington," interjected, his tone indicating the conversation had strayed from professional boundaries. "There are significant details regarding the implementation of these provisions that we should discuss. I've prepared documents outlining the transition plan James established." He removed another folder from his briefcase and slid copies across the table to each of us. "In summary, Olivia's 50% ownership will be transferred immediately. However, James recognized her lack of specific industry experience and arranged for a 6-month transition period during which she will work with a management consultant specializing in shipping logistics and operations." I flipped through the document, stunned by the thoroughness of grandfather's planning. He had arranged for me to receive intensive training in industry specifics while building on my existing management skills. He had identified key personnel at Montgomery Shipping who could provide operational insights. He had even outlined a communication plan for informing employees and clients about the leadership changes. "As for Ethan's path," Mr. Harrington continued, "James has outlined a 5-year professional development track beginning in operations and moving through each department of the company. Upon successful completion of this track, evaluated by objective performance metrics rather than family assessment, he will be eligible for executive leadership." Ethan snorted derisively. "And who exactly will be running the company during this ridiculous development track?" "James has appointed an interim CEO, Margaret Chen, the current COO, who will work closely with the newly formed board of directors. Olivia will serve as board chair, with Robert as an advisory member without voting rights." Margaret Chen. I knew the name from grandfather's stories. She had been with Montgomery Shipping for over 20 years, rising through the ranks through demonstrated capability and strategic thinking. Grandfather had always spoken of her with genuine respect. My father stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "This is unacceptable. James had no right to undermine my authority. This way, I've dedicated my life to Montgomery Shipping." "Actually, Robert," Mr. Harrington said calmly, "as the founder and majority shareholder, James had every legal right to structure the succession of his company as he saw fit." These provisions are legally binding." He closed his briefcase with a decisive click. "I suggest you all take some time to review these documents and process this information. We can reconvene later this week to discuss implementation details." James was quite clear that these arrangements are non-negotiable, but he did build in supports to ensure a successful transition for everyone involved. As Mr. Harrington gathered his things, my family sat in stunned silence. The carefully constructed hierarchy that had organized our relationships for decades had been completely upended. The assumptions that had defined our family dynamics, that Ethan was destined for leadership, that my father's authority was absolute, that my path was of lesser value, had been not just questioned but fundamentally rejected by the patriarch whose opinion they had claimed to revere. I felt a complex mixture of emotions. Vindication, certainly, but also apprehension about the responsibilities now placed on my shoulders. And beneath it all, a profound sense of being truly seen and valued by the person whose opinion had mattered most to me. As we prepared to leave the conference room, Mr. Harrington placed a hand lightly on my arm. "Ms. Montgomery, a moment, please." When the others had exited, still too shocked for further confrontation, he handed me a small envelope. Your grandfather asked me to give you this privately," he said. "He thought you might need it after today's meeting." I took the envelope, my name written on it in grandfather's distinctive handwriting. Inside was a simple note card containing just one line. "Remember what Atticus told Scout? Real courage is knowing you're licked before you begin, but you begin anyway and see it through no matter what." For the first time since receiving news of his death, I smiled. Even now, grandfather was sending me exactly the message I needed to hear. The drive back to my apartment passed in a blur. I barely registered the familiar streets, my mind still processing the seismic shift that had occurred in that conference room. Grandfather's words echoed in my thoughts, along with the stunned expressions on my family's faces. Expressions that had quickly transformed from shock to calculation as they left the attorney's office. My mother had avoided eye contact completely. My father had muttered something about discussing this as a family before striding to his Mercedes. Ethan had simply glared at me as if I'd orchestrated this outcome, despite being as surprised as everyone else. I parked in front of Mrs. Galloway's house and sat motionless in my car, clutching grandfather's note. The magnitude of what had just happened began to sink in. I wasn't just the recipient of a substantial inheritance. I was now the majority stakeholder in a company that employed over 300 people, managed a fleet of cargo vessels, and maintained operations across 3 states. The responsibility was overwhelming. When I finally made my way up the stairs to my apartment, I found a large manila envelope propped against my door. Inside was a thick folder labeled Montgomery Shipping Orientation Materials with a post-it. Note in Mr. Harrington's handwriting. "Your grandfather suggested you might appreciate some time to review these privately before meeting with the executive team." I spread the contents across my small kitchen table. Organizational charts, financial summaries, strategic plans, personnel files for key positions, and a detailed history of the company's evolution from its founding to present day. Attached to the history was another note in grandfather's handwriting. "The past informs the future, but doesn't dictate it. Your perspective is needed, not despite your different path, but because of it." My phone began ringing almost immediately after. I'd settled in to review the materials. First my father, then my mother, then Ethan. I let each call go to voicemail, needing time to think before engaging in what would inevitably be difficult conversations. Their messages escalated in urgency and agitation. "Olivia, call me immediately. We need to discuss a family response to this situation." My father's voice was tight with barely controlled anger. "Darling, your father and I are concerned about the pressure this places on you. We should meet and talk about arrangements that would be less disruptive." My mother's tone was honeyed, a sure sign she was strategizing. This is completely insane. You know you're not qualified for this. Call me back so we can figure out how to fix grandfather's mistake. Ethan, characteristically blunt. I silenced my phone and turned back to the documents before me. By midnight, I had filled a notebook with questions, observations, and initial thoughts. Montgomery Shipping was profitable but had grown complacent in certain areas. The company had impressive customer loyalty but lagged in technological innovation. Employee retention was strong at the upper levels, but showed concerning turnover in middle management. Around 1 a.m, exhausted but unable to sleep, I opened my laptop and searched for Margaret Chen, the COO grandfather had appointed, as interim CEO. Her LinkedIn profile showed an impressive career trajectory from logistics coordinator to operations manager to her current position. Her education included both technical certifications in maritime shipping and an executive MBA earned while working full-time. She had published articles on supply chain resilience and sustainability in shipping, topics grandfather had often discussed with interest during our Sunday conversations. I was about to close my computer when an email notification appeared. The sender was Margaret Chen, the timestamp, 12:58 a.m. Ms. Montgomery, it began. I hope this message finds you well, though I imagine today has been overwhelming. Your grandfather shared his succession plans with me 6 months ago to ensure a smooth transition when the time came. He spoke of you with great respect and confidence. I understand you'll need time to process everything, but when you're ready, I'd welcome the opportunity to meet and discuss how we can work together to honor your grandfather's vision for Montgomery Shipping while incorporating your own perspective. Your experience in community development brings valuable insights our industry often lacks. Please know that the operational team is solid and day-to-day business continues uninterrupted. There is no rush for immediate decisions. Your grandfather designed this transition thoughtfully, with support systems in place. At your convenience, my door is open. I'm available to answer any questions as you review the materials, Mr. Harrington provided. Respectfully, Margaret Chen. The email's tone, professional yet supportive, confident without being presumptuous, provided unexpected reassurance. Someone in the company understood what was happening and wasn't panicking. Someone respected grandfather's decision, and by extension, my potential contribution. I replied with a brief but sincere thank you, suggesting we meet later in the week after I'd had more time with the orientation materials. Then I finally collapsed into bed, emotionally drained but with a glimmer of determination forming beneath. The exhaustion. Morning arrived with the chime of another email, this one from Marcos at the community center, checking if I needed more time off following my grandfather's funeral. I realized with a start that I hadn't even considered how this inheritance would affect my current job and responsibilities. The programs I managed served over 200 families. I couldn't simply abandon them without proper transition planning. I was drafting a response when my doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I saw my mother standing on the small landing, impeccably dressed in a cream-colored suit despite the early hour. With a deep breath, I opened the door. "Olivia," she said, sweeping past me into the apartment before I could decide whether to invite her in. "We need to talk." She glanced around the space with barely disguised disapproval. My apartment was modest but comfortable, bookshelves lining the walls, an overstuffed couch with colorful throw pillows, plants on every windowsill, and art from local community center students brightening the walls. "I see you're reviewing the company materials," she observed, noticing the documents still spread across my table. "Good. You'll need to understand what you're dealing with before you make any decisions." She sat on one of my kitchen chairs, crossing her legs and setting her designer handbag beside her. "I'll be direct, Olivia. This situation your grandfather has created is untenable. Your father has run Montgomery Shipping successfully for 15 years. Ethan has been groomed since childhood to take over. The board, the clients, the industry partners. Everyone expects leadership to continue through them. I remained standing, unwilling to position myself as a supplicant in my own home. Grandfather obviously had different ideas about what constitutes success and appropriate leadership. Her lips tightened momentarily before she continued, her voice measured. Your grandfather had become idealistic in his later years, disconnected from business realities. These arrangements may sound admirable in theory, but practically speaking, they're disastrous. You have no experience in this industry. I'm aware of that, I acknowledged, and apparently, so was grandfather. That's why he arranged for the transition period and appointed Margaret Chen as interim CEO. Margaret is a competent operations person, but she doesn't have the Montgomery name or connections. Clients expect to work with family leadership. She leaned forward slightly. Olivia, be reasonable. You've never shown any interest in the business. Your community work has been your passion. This arrangement would force you into a role you're neither prepared for nor suited to. The implication was clear. I should voluntarily relinquish control to my father and brother, returning to my little community center job and allowing the family hierarchy to reestablish itself. What exactly are you suggesting, Mom? She smiled, clearly relieved that I seemed open to discussion. It's quite simple. You'll sign over your voting rights to your father, maintaining your ownership percentage for financial benefit, of course. We'll restructure the board accordingly. Ethan will complete an accelerated executive training program, much more appropriate than this entry-level nonsense, and take over as planned. You'll be free to continue your community work without disruption, with significantly more financial resources at your disposal. The arrangement sounded reasonable on the surface. I would gain wealth without responsibility, while the family business continued as planned. It was precisely the kind of compromise my mother excelled at orchestrating, where everyone appeared to win while the underlying power dynamics remained unchanged. And what about grandfather's explicit wishes? His assessment of Dad's leadership priorities? His concerns about Ethan's actual readiness versus theoretical knowledge? My mother waved a dismissive hand. James was always a bit sanctimonious, especially toward the end. He built a successful company, yes, but times have changed. Robert and Ethan understand today's business environment. James was living in the past. I walked to the window, looking out at Mrs. Galloway's carefully tended garden below. Did you read the entire transition plan grandfather created? Skimmed it, she admitted. The details are less important than the broader arrangement, which is simply unworkable. I've been reading it all night, I said quietly. It's extraordinarily thoughtful, comprehensive. He identified specific challenges the company faces that will require new perspectives. He outlined an integration process that builds on my existing skills while providing support in areas where I lack experience. He even annotated the organizational chart with personal notes about key employees, their strengths, their concerns, their untapped potential. I turned back to face her. This wasn't a sentimental decision, Mom, or a punishment for how you've treated me. It was a strategic choice based on his assessment of what Montgomery Shipping needs to thrive in the future. Her composed facade cracked slightly. Don't be naive, Olivia. Of course it was personal. He resented how we prioritized the business over his sentimental notions of family time. This is his posthumous revenge, using you to undermine everything your father and I have built. Is that how you see me? As a weapon grandfather is wielding from the grave? The characterization stung, despite my resolve to remain calm. Not as someone who might actually have valuable perspectives to contribute. You've chosen a path entirely separate from the business world, she said. There's no shame in acknowledging that corporate leadership isn't your strength. We're offering a compromise that respects your inheritance while placing operational control with those prepared for it. I studied my mother's perfectly composed expression. Behind her carefully selected words, I recognized the same dismissive assessment that had shaped our relationship throughout my life. In her view, my choices had always been less valuable, my priorities misguided, my potential limited to supporting roles in the narratives others created. Something shifted within me, a quiet certainty replacing the swirl of confusion and self-doubt that had followed yesterday's revelation. "I appreciate your visit, Mom, and your concern," I said, my voice stronger than I expected. "But I won't be signing over my voting rights or circumventing grandfather's carefully considered succession plan. I'll be meeting with Margaret Chen later this week to discuss implementation details." My mother's expression hardened. "You're making a serious mistake. Your father and Ethan have relationships with clients going back years. If they leave the company—" "Grandfather anticipated that possibility," I interrupted, recalling a section of the transition document. "There are retention incentives for key personnel, including family members, who choose to support the new leadership structure. There are also contingency plans for client relationships if disruptions occur." "You can't possibly believe you can step into this role successfully," she said, her voice rising slightly. "The board will resist. Industry partners will question the company's stability. Competitors will take advantage of the uncertainty." "All legitimate concerns that grandfather addressed in his planning," I acknowledged. "The question isn't whether challenges exist, but whether I'm willing to face them. And I am." She stood abruptly, gathering her handbag. "You'll regret this, Olivia. When the company struggles under inexperienced leadership, when you're drowning in responsibilities you're unprepared for, when your precious community center work suffers because you're trapped in board meetings, you'll wish you'd listened." "To reason?" "Maybe," I conceded, "but I'd regret ignoring grandfather's faith in me more. He believed I could do this, Mom. For once in my life, someone in this family looked at me and saw capability instead of limitation. I owe it to him, and to myself, to at least try." She moved toward the door, then paused. "Your father will be furious. He's already consulting attorneys about contesting the will." "That's his choice." But Mr. Harrington seemed confident the provisions would stand. "This will change everything, Olivia. Family dynamics, holiday gatherings, your relationship with Ethan. Are you prepared for that consequence?" The question gave me pause. Despite the constant subtle undermining, the dismissal of my choices, the clear favoritism shown to Ethan, they were still my family. The prospect of open conflict rather than polite dismissal was daunting. "I'm not doing this to punish anyone," I said finally. "I'm doing it because grandfather saw something in me that even I didn't fully recognize, and I owe it to his memory to discover what that is. If that changes our family dynamic, perhaps it needed to change." My mother's lips pressed into a thin line. "I see you've made your decision. We'll proceed accordingly." Her tone made it clear that proceeding accordingly would involve continued resistance rather than acceptance. After she left, I returned to the company documents spread across my table, but found it difficult to focus. My mother's visit had clarified something important. This inheritance wasn't just about money or business assets. It was about recognizing my own worth in a family that had consistently undervalued it. It was about honoring grandfather's belief in my capabilities when he'd had the courage to see beyond conventional definitions of success and leadership. I picked up my phone and dialed Marcos at the community center. "I need to talk to you about a significant change in my circumstances," I began, "and I could use your advice about managing transitions while honoring commitments to the people who depend on you." As I explained the situation, I felt a growing sense of determination replacing the initial overwhelm. The path ahead would be challenging, but for the first time, I was walking it with the confidence that came from being truly seen and valued. Whether I ultimately succeeded or failed in this new role, I would no longer be invisible. 2 days. After the will reading, I stood before the glass and steel headquarters of Montgomery Shipping for the first time in nearly 7 years. The 20-story building dominated the waterfront business district, its architecture a blend of traditional maritime elements and modern corporate design, much like the company itself, which balanced century-old shipping traditions with contemporary, global commerce. My last visit had been during college, when I'd completed a reluctant summer internship at my father's insistence. I'd been placed in the marketing department, given meaningless busy work, and repeatedly reminded that I was there, as a Montgomery, not because of any actual qualifications. The experience had only reinforced my determination to forge my own path away from the family business. Now I was returning not as an unwanted intern, but as the majority shareholder. I wore a navy pantsuit, not the designer label my mother would have chosen, but well-tailored and professional, with a simple pendant necklace that had been a gift from grandfather on my graduate school completion. My hands were steady as I passed through the revolving door into the marble-floored lobby, though my heartbeat quickened. The receptionist glanced up with a practiced smile. "Welcome to Montgomery Shipping. How may I assist you?" "I'm Olivia Montgomery. I have a meeting with Margaret Chen." The woman's eyes widened slightly, the only indication she recognized the name, before her professional demeanor reasserted itself. "Of course, Ms. Montgomery. Ms. Chen is expecting you. 18th floor, the executive suite. Samuel will escort you." She gestured to a security guard who had materialized beside the reception desk. As we rode the elevator upward, I noticed Samuel casting curious glances in my direction. The company grapevine had clearly been active. News of the inheritance and leadership change must have spread throughout the building. "It's good to have you here, Ms. Montgomery," he said finally as we approached the upper floors. "Your grandfather spoke highly of you." The comment surprised me. "You knew my grandfather well?" Samuel nodded. He made a point of knowing everyone, from the maintenance staff to the executives, treated everyone with the same respect too. Every Christmas, he'd personally hand out bonus envelopes to the security team, ask about our families by name. This aligned with the grandfather I knew, but contrasted sharply with my father's approach to support staff, whom he barely acknowledged. Another small confirmation that grandfather's assessment of leadership styles in his letter had been accurate. The elevator doors opened onto the executive floor, where glass-walled offices surrounded an open workspace filled with assistants and coordinators. Heads turned as Samuel led me through, whispers following in our wake. I kept my posture straight, my expression neutral, though internally I felt like an imposter walking into a world where I didn't belong. Margaret Chen waited at the entrance to a conference room, her handshake firm and direct. In person, she was more imposing than her LinkedIn profile suggested, tall and athletic, with an air of unfussy competence in her tailored charcoal suit and sensible shoes. Her salt and pepper hair was cropped short, her gaze evaluative but not unkind. "Ms. Montgomery, thank you for coming." She dismissed Samuel with a nod of thanks. "I've set aside the morning for our discussion. Would you prefer coffee before we begin?" "Please," I acknowledged, grateful for the momentary reprieve to gather my thoughts. Once we were settled in the conference room, a space with stunning views of the harbor where Montgomery ships regularly docked, Margaret addressed the elephant in the room. "I imagine you have questions about why James structured his succession." "Plan as he did," she began. "He anticipated that." She slid a sealed envelope across the table. Unlike grandfather's letter at the will reading, this one wasn't formal or legal, just a plain envelope with Olivia, for when you visit headquarters, written in his familiar handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of his personal stationery. "Olivia, if you're reading this, you've taken the first brave step toward claiming your rightful place at Montgomery Shipping. I'm proud of you, but not surprised. You've always had more courage than you realized. You're likely feeling overwhelmed, perhaps even questioning whether I've made a terrible mistake. Let me assure you, my decision was not made lightly or sentimentally. During our Sunday conversations, I recognized in you the qualities that built this company long before I recognized their absence in others, who presumed themselves entitled to lead it. Margaret can explain the operational details, but I want to emphasize what she cannot tell you. Montgomery Shipping was never meant to be merely a profitable business. It was created to serve communities, to connect people across distances, to transport not just goods, but opportunities. Somewhere along the way, that founding purpose has become secondary to prestige and profit margins. Your experience at the Community Center has given you insights into human needs and social systems that cannot be taught in business school. Your empathy is not a weakness, but a strategic advantage in an industry that has become increasingly transactional. Trust your instincts. Ask questions others don't think to ask. And remember that the Montgomery name on the building doesn't make you qualified to lead. Your character does. With faith in your capabilities, grandfather. I folded the letter carefully, blinking back unexpected tears. Margaret waited patiently, her expression suggesting she understood the emotional weight of the moment. He planned this transition meticulously, she said when I'd composed myself. I've worked with James for over 20 years, and I've never seen him so thorough about any business matter. Why? I asked simply. Why me? My father has run the company for years. Ethan has the formal business education I lack. Margaret's expression turned thoughtful. May I speak candidly, Ms. Montgomery? Please, and it's Olivia. Very well, Olivia. The company your grandfather built and the company your father has been running are fundamentally different enterprises. James created an organization centered on long-term relationships and community impact, with profit as a necessary component rather than the exclusive goal. Under Robert's leadership, those priorities have gradually inverted. She gestured toward you, the window, where container ships moved methodically through the harbor. We're still profitable, still respected in the industry. But decisions are increasingly made based on quarterly returns rather than long-term sustainability. Employee initiatives have been cut. Community partnerships have been reduced to photo opportunities rather than substantive engagements. And my brother? I asked. Grandfather was quite critical of his preparation. Margaret chose her words carefully. Ethan has impressive theoretical knowledge, but he's been insulated from operational realities. His time has been spent in strategic planning sessions and client entertainment, not understanding the day-to-day functions that keep this company running. James believed that was a critical gap in his preparation for leadership. She opened a folder on the table, revealing a detailed organizational chart. James created a specific onboarding plan for you. Unlike Ethan's entry-level path, yours recognizes your existing management experience while addressing industry-specific knowledge gaps. You'll work directly with me and department heads over the next 6 months, simultaneously learning operations and bringing your unique perspective to our strategic planning. The plan was comprehensive, with weekly goals, key relationships to develop, and specific operational areas to master. It reflected confidence in my ability to learn quickly while acknowledging the legitimate challenges of entering a specialized industry. What about my father? I asked. He hasn't returned to the office since the will reading. Robert has taken a leave of absence, Margaret confirmed. His assistant reports he's consulting with attorneys about contesting the will, though Mr. Harrington seems confident it will withstand any challenges. And the broader company reaction? I noticed quite a few stares on my way in. Margaret nodded frankly. There's considerable curiosity, some apprehension, and a fair amount of speculation. Your father and brother have their supporters, particularly among executives who've benefited from the current approach. Others, especially long-term employees who remember your grandfather's leadership style, are cautiously optimistic about the change. She leaned forward slightly. If I may offer some advice, don't try to win everyone over immediately. Focus on building relationships with key department heads, understanding core operations, and identifying one or two initiatives where your perspective could add immediate value. Actions will matter more than words in establishing your credibility. Her practical guidance cut through some of my anxiety. This wasn't about proving my worth to my family, an impossible task given their entrenched perspectives. It was about demonstrating through consistent action that grandfather's faith in me was justified. One more thing, Margaret added, and this may be challenging given the circumstances. Consider having individual conversations with your father and brother once the initial shock has passed. Not to negotiate away your authority, but to explore whether there's a path forward that acknowledges their experience while maintaining the structural changes your grandfather established. I raised an eyebrow skeptically. You believe that's possible? After their reactions? Possible? Yes. Easy? Certainly not. She met my gaze directly. But James valued family connection despite his concerns about their business approaches. He hoped for reconciliation, not permanent division. Whether that's achievable is ultimately not for me to determine. Our conversation shifted to operational matters, current projects, upcoming decisions, key personnel I should meet. Margaret's straightforward competence was reassuring. Whatever my learning curve might be, the company was in capable hands during the transition. As our meeting concluded, Margaret offered to show me grandfather's former office, which had remained unchanged since his retirement. The large corner suite featured maritime artifacts, bookshelves filled with industry references and classical literature, and a spectacular view of the harbor and city beyond. He used to say he kept this view to remind himself that ships exist to connect places, not just occupy water, Margaret remarked. It informed his whole approach to business. I moved around the space, touching the desk where he'd made decisions that built the company, noting framed photographs, including several of me at various ages that I hadn't realized he'd kept, in his workplace. This will be your office when you're ready, Margaret said. In the meantime, I've had a workspace prepared next to mine where you'll have better access to the operational teams during your learning phase. The thought of eventually occupying grandfather's space, filling the considerable void his absence had created, was simultaneously inspiring and intimidating. Not because of the physical office itself, but because of what it represented. The trust he'd placed in me to carry forward his vision while bringing my own perspective to its evolution. Before we tour the departments, there's something else. You should know, Margaret said. Your brother came to see me yesterday. My stomach tightened. And? He proposed an alternative arrangement, one where he would assume the CEO position immediately, with you maintaining nominal board chairmanship but delegating day-to-day authority to him. That's not what grandfather wanted, I said firmly. No, it isn't, she agreed. I made that clear to him. His response suggested he'll continue seeking ways to circumvent the established succession plan. Should I be concerned? Margaret considered the question carefully before answering. Ethan has relationships with certain board members and key clients. He could potentially create disruption during the transition period, but James anticipated that possibility and built safeguards into the governance structure. The more immediate challenge will be managing the narrative internally and externally during this period of change. She checked her watch. The department heads are gathering for lunch in the executive dining room. It would be an opportune moment for you to meet them in a less formal setting before tomorrow's official introduction. As we walked toward the elevator, Margaret added, one last piece of advice, if I may. The most powerful tool you have right now isn't your ownership percentage or board position. It's genuine curiosity. Ask questions. Listen to the answers. People who feel truly heard will forgive a multitude of knowledge gaps. It was remarkably similar to an approach I'd developed at the community center, where listening to residents' actual needs, rather than imposing predetermined solutions, had been the key to creating effective programs. Perhaps my experience wasn't as irrelevant to this environment as my family had always insisted. Standing straighter, I followed Margaret toward my first significant test as Montgomery Shipping's unexpected heir. Lunch with the leadership team that had, until days ago, reported to my father and anticipated my brother's ascension. I touched the pendant grandfather had given me, drawing strength from the memory of his confidence in me. Whatever doubts I might harbor about my readiness for this role, I would not let them see uncertainty. I would channel grandfather's quiet dignity, his thoughtful leadership, his unwavering integrity. And I would begin, as Margaret suggested, not by asserting authority, but by demonstrating genuine interest in the people whose expertise would be critical to the company's and my own success. The first steps of this journey would set the tone for everything that followed. I drew a deep breath and entered the dining room, prepared to begin earning the trust my grandfather had already given me. The executive dining room fell silent as Margaret and I entered. 8 department heads sat around a large table, their expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed skepticism. I recognized several faces from the company materials I'd studied, though seeing them in person heightened my awareness of just how much experience was gathered in the room, and how little I had in comparison. Margaret made brief introductions, her tone matter-of-fact as she presented me as Olivia Montgomery, board chair and majority shareholder. No embellishments, no attempts to justify my presence or overstate my qualifications, just the simple reality of my new position. "Please, continue your lunch," I said, taking the empty seat beside Lawrence Gable, the gray-haired operations director who'd been with the company for 30 years. "I'm here to listen and learn." The conversation resumed cautiously, with pointed glances in my direction as they discussed upcoming projects, quarterly projections, and operational challenges. I asked occasional questions, thoughtful ones, I hoped, and took mental notes about both the content of their discussion and the dynamics between them. Victor Reeves, the sales director, seemed particularly eager to establish his importance, detailing high-profile client meetings and emphasizing his close relationship with my father. By contrast, Diane Wu, the young technology director, spoke directly and substantively about system upgrades needed to improve tracking efficiency, without any apparent agenda beyond addressing operational needs. As coffee was served, Lawrence Gable finally addressed me directly. "If I may, Ms. Montgomery, everyone's wondering, but no one's asking. What are your plans for the company?" The directness of the question silenced the table again. All eyes turned to me, awaiting an answer that would signal whether to view me as a threat or potential ally. "First, I plan to acknowledge what I don't know," I replied honestly. "I have management experience, but not in this industry. I won't pretend otherwise." A few eyebrows raised at this admission, not the defensive response they'd clearly expected. Second, I plan to honor my grandfather's vision while recognizing that businesses must evolve. Montgomery Shipping was built on principles of excellence, relationship building, and community impact. Those values aren't negotiable, but how we express them in today's market requires fresh thinking. I took a sip of water, meeting each gaze directly as I continued. Third, I plan to learn from the expertise gathered in this room. My grandfather valued your contributions, and so do I. My role isn't to dictate strategies in areas where you have decades of collective experience, but to ensure our decisions align with our core values and long-term vision. Lawrence nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful rather than dismissive. Your grandfather said something similar when he started the company, that his job wasn't to know everything, but to gather people who collectively did. He was a wise man, I acknowledged. He was, Lawrence agreed. Though in recent years, wisdom hasn't always been our guiding principle. The subtle criticism of my father's leadership hung in the air. Margaret shot Lawrence a warning glance, but I appreciated his candor. "I'm interested in your perspectives on that," I said, addressing the entire table. What aspects of Montgomery Shipping's operations or culture would you preserve, and what might benefit from reconsideration? The question opened a floodgate. After initial hesitation, the department heads began sharing observations and concerns that had apparently gone unaddressed for years. Diane Wu described outdated technology, protocols that increased costs and decreased efficiency. Martin Taylor from Human Resources detailed talent retention challenges resulting from compensation structures that rewarded executives while squeezing middle management. Elizabeth Farrow, the soft-spoken compliance director, raised concerns about environmental standards that met minimum requirements but fell short of emerging industry best practices. Only Victor Reeves remained defensive, repeatedly emphasizing the sales division's record numbers and dismissing suggestions about client relationship approaches as naive idealism that would threaten revenue targets. I listened more than I spoke, asking clarifying questions and taking notes. By the time lunch concluded, I had a clearer picture of the company's strengths and challenges, and of which department heads might become allies in the transition ahead. As we exited the dining room, Lawrence Gable fell into step beside me. "Do you have a moment, Ms. Montgomery? There's something you should see." With a questioning glance at Margaret, who nodded her approval, I followed Lawrence to the elevator. He pressed the button for the 4th floor, several levels below the executive offices. "Records department," he explained as we descended. "Not the digital archives, the old paper files from before everything was computerized." The 4th floor was noticeably different from the polished executive level, utilitarian with fluorescent lighting and beige walls lined with filing cabinets. A few staff members looked up in surprise as Lawrence led me through to a back room, filled with older storage systems. "Your grandfather insisted we maintain these archives even after digitization," Lawrence explained, pulling a key from his pocket to unlock a cabinet labeled Founding Documents, 1962-1975. "Said some things? Shouldn't exist only in ones and zeros that could be altered or deleted." He withdrew a dusty binder and set it on a nearby table. "Original business plan for Montgomery Shipping. James wrote it himself before securing his first investors." I opened the binder carefully, finding typewritten pages with handwritten annotations in the margins. The first page featured a mission statement that made my breath catch. To create a shipping enterprise that measures success not merely in profit margins, but in the strength of the communities it serves, the welfare of its employees, and the integrity of its operations. Montgomery Shipping will transport goods efficiently while never forgetting that our true cargo is opportunity, connection, and social responsibility. The language echoed almost exactly what Grandfather had written in his private note to me. This wasn't a recent idealistic perspective developed in retirement. It had been his founding vision 60 years ago. "He never wavered from this," Lawrence said quietly. "Even during financial downturns when investors pressured him to cut community programs or employee benefits. Short-term thinking creates short-term companies," he always said. I turned pages slowly, discovering detailed plans for employee profit sharing, community reinvestment initiatives, and environmental considerations that had been remarkably forward-thinking for the 1960s. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked, though I was beginning to understand. Lawrence's weathered face turned solemn. "Because over the past 15 years, I've watched your father systematically dismantle nearly every principle in this document. While maintaining the appearance of honoring your grandfather's legacy, the Montgomery name is still respected, but the Montgomery vision has been compromised." He closed the binder carefully. "Many of us who worked directly with James have been waiting, hoping he would eventually step in and correct the company's course. Now we understand he chose a different approach." The realization dawned slowly. "You think I'm his course correction?" Lawrence nodded. "You have his eyes, you know, not just the color, the way you listen, really listen, before speaking. He did that too. Made people feel heard even when he disagreed with them." You're not concerned about my lack of industry experience. Experience can be acquired. Values are either there or they're not. He tapped the binder. I believe James saw his own values in you, not in the family members who presumed themselves entitled to his legacy. As we returned to the elevator, Lawrence added, "Not everyone shares my perspective, of course. Victor Reeves and several others have benefited considerably from your father's approach. They'll resist changes that prioritize long-term sustainability over quarterly bonuses. And where do the others stand? Wait and see mostly. Cautiously. Hopeful, some of them. Your lunch questions impressed a few, especially your willingness to acknowledge what you don't know." The elevator doors opened, and he pressed the button for the executive floor. "One bit of advice, if I may. Schedule one-on-one meetings with each department head before making any significant decisions. Some will be more forthcoming privately than they were at that table." Back on the executive floor, Margaret was waiting with a schedule for the remainder of the day. Facility tours, introductory meetings with administrative staff, and preliminary discussions about upcoming board obligations. As we walked toward the manufacturing division, she raised an eyebrow. "Lawrence showed you the archives?" "The original business plan," I confirmed. It was illuminating. She nodded. "He doesn't share those documents with many people. Consider it a vote of confidence." "Or a reminder of responsibility," I added quietly. The afternoon passed in a blur of introductions, information, and first impressions. I met shipping coordinators, logistics specialists, account managers, and support staff, putting faces to the organizational structure I'd been studying. Throughout, I maintained what I hoped was a balance of attentive interest and quiet confidence, though internally I fluctuated between moments of genuine excitement about the company's potential and waves of imposter syndrome about my ability to guide it. By 5 o'clock, mental fatigue was setting in. I'd absorbed more maritime terminology, operational procedures, and personnel dynamics than seemed possible in a single day. As we concluded the final departmental tour, Margaret checked her watch. "That completes today's orientation. Tomorrow we'll focus on financial operations and client relationship management. Unless you'd prefer to reschedule?" She studied my face, clearly noting the signs of information overload. "Tomorrow works," I assured her, refusing to show weakness on my first day. Though I'll need the evening to process everything I've learned today. As we returned to the executive floor to gather my things, her assistant approached with a concerned expression. "Ms. Chen, Mr. Montgomery is in your office. He's been waiting for nearly an hour and refuses to leave until he speaks with his sister." "Ethan, I should have anticipated this confrontation." Margaret turned to me. "Would you prefer to reschedule this discussion for another day?" I considered the option. Postponing would allow me more time to prepare, but it would also signal to Ethan, and by extension to observing staff, that I was intimidated by the confrontation. In the delicate political environment of the company, perception mattered. "No," I decided. "I'll speak with him now." Margaret nodded approvingly. "I'll be in the adjacent conference room if you need me. Remember, as board chair and majority shareholder, you're not obligated to defend your position." Taking a steadying breath, I entered her office. Ethan stood by the window, his back to the door, his posture rigid with tension. He turned as I entered, his expression a mixture of anger and calculation. "Finally decided to show up at the company you think you're going to run?" he said by way of greeting. "Hello, Ethan," I replied calmly, setting my notebook on Margaret's desk. "I understand you wanted to speak with me." "This farce has gone on long enough," he stated flatly. "Grandfather was clearly not in his right mind when he made these arrangements. You need to sign control over to me before you damage the company and embarrass yourself." The bluntness of his approach was typical Ethan. No subtlety, no attempt at persuasion, just absolute certainty in his own rightness. "That's not going to happen," I said simply. "Be reasonable, Olivia. You know nothing about this business. You've spent your career making macaroni art with disadvantaged children while I've been preparing to lead Montgomery Shipping since I was in high school. The familiar dismissal of my work stung, but less sharply than it once had. My work at the community center involved managing budgets, staff, regulatory compliance, and strategic partnerships, all transferable skills. And according to grandfather's assessment, your preparation has focused on theory rather than operational understanding. His face flushed. That's absurd. I have an MBA from Wharton. I've been involved in major client acquisitions. Dad has been grooming me to take over a company that has gradually drifted from its founding values, I finished for him. Grandfather was quite clear about that in his letter. Ethan's expression hardened. I've already spoken with several board members and key clients. They're concerned about the stability of leadership under these new arrangements. If you continue with this, you'll trigger resignations and lost accounts that will damage Montgomery Shipping for years. The threat was thinly veiled, but I recognized the legitimate risk it represented. Without client relationships and institutional knowledge, even majority ownership wouldn't ensure the company's success. I understand your disappointment, I said, choosing my words carefully. This isn't what any of us expected, but grandfather's decision is legally binding, and I intend to honor both his wishes and his confidence in me. By destroying everything Dad and I have built? By returning to the values on which the company was founded, I corrected, which doesn't preclude your involvement, Ethan. Grandfather's plan includes a path for you, just not the immediate executive role you expected. He laughed bitterly. You expect me to start in entry-level positions, file paperwork, and answer phones while my sister, who couldn't tell a container ship from a cruise liner a week ago, sits in the chairman's office? I expect you to recognize that grandfather designed this transition based on his assessment of what Montgomery Shipping needs, I replied. Your industry knowledge is valuable, Ethan. Your connections matter. But perhaps there are aspects of the business operations that would strengthen your leadership if you experienced them directly. This is ridiculous. He paced the office, frustration evident in every movement. What do you really want, Olivia? Money? A title with no responsibilities? Name your price to step aside. The assumption that everything could be reduced to a transaction, that principals were just negotiating positions, reflected exactly the mindset grandfather had found concerning in my father's and brother's approach to business. This isn't about price, Ethan. It's about purpose, about honoring grandfather's vision for the company he built. I've seen the original business plan today. Have you? His momentary confusion answered my question. I suggest you read it, I continued. It might help you understand why grandfather structured his succession plan as he did. Montgomery Shipping was never meant to be merely profitable. It was designed to create value while honoring values. Ethan's expression shifted from anger to calculated assessment. You're really going through with this, aren't you? Playing corporate executive until you inevitably fail? I'm honoring grandfather's faith in me, I said simply, which includes learning everything I can from the experienced professionals here, including you, if you're willing to be part of the transition, rather than undermining it. For a moment, something almost vulnerable flickered across his face. Perhaps recognition that his assumed birthright had never been guaranteed, or realization that his path forward now required adaptation rather than entitlement. But the moment passed quickly, replaced by the polished mask of confidence he'd perfected since childhood. You'll regret this decision, he said coldly. When clients start leaving and the board turns against you, remember this conversation. As he strode toward the door, I called after him, Ethan, this doesn't have to be adversarial. We're still family. He paused without turning. That remains to be seen. After he left, I sank into Margaret's visitor chair, the emotional weight of the confrontation finally hitting me. The family dynamics that had shaped my entire life were fundamentally altered, perhaps irreparably. Yet alongside the sadness was a growing sense of purpose. Today's conversations had reinforced what grandfather had seen. Montgomery Shipping needed reconnection with its founding values, and my perspective might genuinely contribute to that renewal. I pulled out my phone and called Marcos at the community center. "How was day one in the corporate world?" he asked, his tone supportive despite his concerns about my departure from the nonprofit sector. "Overwhelming, enlightening. Occasionally terrifying," I admitted. "But also, right, somehow. Like pieces clicking into place that I didn't even know were misaligned." "The kids miss you already," he said. "Especially Zoe. She asked when Ms. Olivia is coming back to finish the storytelling project." The mention of the 7-year-old who had been attending our after-school program brought unexpected tears to my eyes. For all the magnitude of my new responsibilities at Montgomery Shipping, the individual connections at the community center represented impact of a different but equally significant kind. "Tell her I'll be there for the showcase night next week," I promised. "I may be inheriting a shipping company, but I'm not abandoning our projects." As I ended the call, Margaret returned to the office. "Productive conversation with your brother?" she asked, though her expression suggested she'd anticipated the outcome. "Not immediately," I acknowledged. "But seeds planted, perhaps." She nodded, gathering her things to leave for the day. Change takes time, in organizations and in families. James understood that better than most. As we walked together toward the elevator, she added, "By the way, the maintenance staff mentioned they found something in your grandfather's desk that might interest you. They've left it in your temporary office." In the small workspace adjacent to Margaret's, I found a weathered compass in a wooden box. A note in grandfather's handwriting accompanied it. "This guided my first voyage as a merchant marine before I founded Montgomery Shipping. When storms come, and they will, remember that true north doesn't change, even when visibility is poor. Keep this on your desk as a reminder that principles, not circumstances, determine direction." I held the compass carefully, feeling its weight, both physical and symbolic. Day one had brought challenges, revelations, and the first tentative connections that might become alliances. It had also brought confrontation, resistance, and the painful recognition of how deeply the inheritance had fractured family relationships. But through it all, one thing had become increasingly clear. Grandfather hadn't chosen me on a whim or out of sentimentality. He had recognized something in me that connected to his original vision for Montgomery Shipping, a vision that had been obscured but not destroyed during my father's leadership. The compass needle pointed steadily north, unaffected by the building's electrical systems or the metal in the desk. Similarly unwavering was my growing commitment to honor not just the legal requirements of my inheritance, but its deeper purpose. Whether my family ever understood or accepted grandfather's choice, I would strive to prove it had been the right one, not just for me, but for the company he had built and the values it had been founded to express. The following weeks established a rhythm to my new life. Mornings at Montgomery Shipping learning operations, afternoons in meetings with department heads and key clients, evenings reviewing materials and preparing for the next day's challenges. Margaret proved an invaluable guide, explaining industry complexities without condescension, and strategically introducing me to influential contacts within the maritime shipping world. I maintained my commitment to the community center as well, spending Tuesday and Thursday evenings there to ensure a proper transition of my programs and to fulfill promises made to the children and families who depended on them. The contrast between the corporate headquarters and the brightly painted community space provided a balance that kept me grounded as I navigated increasingly complex business responsibilities. 3 weeks after the will reading, I received an unexpected message from my mother. "Dinner tonight, 7 p.m. Your father is ready to discuss a reasonable arrangement. Please be punctual." No greeting, No question about whether I was available, just the typical Montgomery assumption that I would rearrange my schedule to accommodate family demands. In the past, I would have done exactly that. Tonight, however, I had promised to attend 7-year-old Zoe's storytelling showcase at the community center, a culmination of the literacy program I'd developed, where children created and presented their own illustrated stories to parents and community members. I texted back, "Can't make tonight. I have a prior commitment I won't break. Tomorrow lunch?" The response came quickly. "This is important family business, Olivia. Surely your little art projects can wait." The dismissive characterization of my work was so typical that it barely registered anymore. "Not available tonight," I repeated, firmly. "Tomorrow lunch or next week?" After several minutes, my phone buzzed again. "Fine. Tomorrow, 12:30, your father's club." The next day, I arrived at the Oak Ridge Country Club precisely at 12:30, dressed in a professional navy suit that projected confidence without ostentation. The maitre d' recognized me immediately, not from regular attendance, as I'd rarely been invited to join my parents at their club, but because of my resemblance to my father. "Ms. Montgomery, your parents are waiting in the private dining room," he informed me, leading the way through the main restaurant where business executives and society figures conducted their midday meetings. My parents sat at a rectangular table in a room with heavy draperies and wood paneling that muffled sound and ensured privacy. My father, impeccably dressed as always, studied financial documents spread before him. My mother, in her signature St. John knit suit, checked her watch with pointed emphasis as I entered. "You're cutting it close, Olivia," she remarked by way of greeting. "I'm exactly on time," I replied calmly, taking the seat across from them. "I came directly from a meeting with our international logistics team." The possessive "our" was deliberate, a small reminder that Montgomery shipping was now partially mine, not exclusively their domain. My father's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Let's dispense with pleasantries," he said, pushing a folder toward me. "We've had our attorneys review James's will and the corporate bylaws. While the inheritance itself stands on solid legal ground, there are provisions regarding corporate governance that create room for negotiation." I opened the folder to find a detailed proposal with legal annotations. Skimming quickly, I grasped the essential structure. I would maintain majority ownership, but delegate operational authority to my father and strategic planning to Ethan, effectively rendering my position ceremonial while preserving their control. This arrangement respects James's technical bequest while implementing a more practical management structure, my father continued. "You'll receive the financial benefits of ownership without the burden of responsibilities you're unprepared to handle." "And what about grandfather's explicit instructions regarding your advisory-only role and Ethan's required operational experience?" I asked. My mother interjected smoothly. "Darling, those stipulations reflect your grandfather's sentimental thinking in his later years. The reality of business requires pragmatic solutions, not idealistic notions about how things should work." "Sentiment had nothing to do with it," I replied. "I've reviewed his original business plan from 1962. His vision for Montgomery shipping has been consistent for 60 years, building a company that balances profit with purpose, that values community impact alongside financial returns. His concerns about the company's direction under current leadership are well-founded and documented." My father's expression darkened. "You've been speaking with Lawrence Gable." "Among others," I acknowledged. "Longtime employees who remember when Montgomery Shipping measured success by more than quarterly profits." "Those longtime employees are living in the past," my father dismissed. "The shipping industry has changed. Markets have evolved. We've maintained profitability in a challenging sector by making necessary adaptations. By cutting community partnerships, reducing employee benefits, and prioritizing short-term gains over sustainable growth," I countered. Exactly the approach grandfather was concerned about. "This is absurd," my father snapped, his controlled facade cracking. "I've dedicated 30 years to Montgomery Shipping. I understand this business in ways you never will, regardless of how many documents you read or employees you interview. I don't claim to know everything about the shipping industry," I said evenly. "That's why grandfather arranged for a transition. Period, with Margaret Chen's guidance. What I do understand, however, is his founding vision and values, the principles that built Montgomery Shipping and that have been gradually compromised." My mother reached across the table, her manicured hand covering mine in a gesture that appeared supportive but felt constraining. "Olivia, be reasonable. We're offering a compromise that respects your inheritance while acknowledging practical realities. You can continue your community work with substantially more financial resources, while the company remains under experienced management." The temptation was undeniable. Their proposal would allow me to avoid the daily challenges of learning a complex industry, the resistance from those loyal to my father and brother, the constant need to prove myself in an environment where many expected, perhaps even hoped for, my failure. I could return to the work I knew well, with newfound financial security and without family conflict, but accepting their terms would betray grandfather's trust and vision. It would confirm their lifelong assessment of me as incapable of significant leadership, suitable only for supporting roles while the real work was done by others. Most importantly, it would surrender the opportunity to guide Montgomery Shipping back toward its founding principles before those principles were forgotten entirely. "I appreciate the proposal," I said finally, closing the folder. "But I must decline. I intend to fulfill my responsibilities as board chair and majority shareholder exactly as grandfather outlined." "You're making a serious mistake," my father warned, all pretense of negotiation vanishing. "The board won't support an inexperienced leader with impractical ideas about corporate social responsibility in today's competitive environment." "Perhaps," I acknowledged, "but I'm finding that many within the company are quite receptive to reconnecting with Montgomery Shipping's original mission. The current board may indeed resist, which is why grandfather provided for its restructuring over the next 6 months." My mother's expression shifted from persuasive to calculating. "You've developed an impressive confidence in recent weeks. One might almost believe you actually think you can succeed in this role." "I believe I can learn what I need to know," I replied. "And I believe grandfather was right about what Montgomery Shipping needs at this juncture in its history." My father gathered his documents with sharp, angry movements. "When this fails, and it will fail, don't expect us to step in and salvage what remains of the company. You've chosen to reject our guidance and experience. You'll bear the consequences of that decision alone." "I'm not rejecting guidance, Dad. I'm seeking it from multiple sources, including Margaret Chen, Lawrence Gable, and other experienced professionals within the company. What I'm rejecting is an arrangement that would undermine grandfather's explicit intentions." As we prepared to leave, my mother paused. "There's one more thing you should consider, Olivia. Your brother is meeting with Callahan Shipping this afternoon, our largest competitor. They've expressed interest in bringing him on as executive vice president with significant equity options." The implied threat was clear. Ethan would take his knowledge of Montgomery Shipping's operations, client relationships, and strategic plans to our primary competitor if I didn't agree to their terms. "That would be an unfortunate choice," I said, carefully, "but one he's free to make. Grandfather's succession plan includes a place for Ethan at Montgomery Shipping, just not the immediate executive role he expected. If he chooses to reject that opportunity out of pride or impatience, that's his decision." My father stood abruptly. "This conversation is clearly pointless. You've made your position clear, as have we. I suggest you review those corporate governance documents carefully before our next board meeting. You may find your authority less absolute than you believe." They departed without further pleasantries, leaving me alone in the private dining room. The confrontation had been predictable, yet it still left me shaken. Not because of their disapproval. I'd lived with that most of my life, but because of the escalating stakes. Ethan potentially joining our largest competitor represented a genuine threat to Montgomery Shipping's stability during an already challenging transition. As I signaled for the check, a familiar voice spoke from the doorway. Tough conversation? I turned to find Charles Bennett, my grandfather's oldest friend and former business partner, standing there with his signature bow tie and sympathetic expression. In his 80s now, Charles had retired from active business involvement years ago but remained a respected figure in local commerce. You could say that, I acknowledged, surprised by his presence. Were you dining here too? Actually, I was waiting for you. He settled into the chair my father had vacated. James asked me to check in on you about a month after the will reading. Said you might need a friendly perspective by then. Grandfather arranged this? I asked, amazed once again by his foresight. Charles nodded. He knew Robert and Diane wouldn't accept his decision easily, and he wanted to ensure you had support beyond Margaret Chen's professional guidance. You knew about the inheritance arrangements? James discussed his plans with me last year, Charles confirmed. Asked my opinion as someone who'd known all of you since childhood. And what was your opinion? I asked, genuinely curious. Charles considered his response carefully. I told him that you reminded me of James himself at your age, more interested in positive impact than personal recognition, more concerned with how decisions affect people than how they affect quarterly statements. He paused, his expression turning reflective. Montgomery Shipping was never just a business to James. It was a vehicle for creating opportunity, for employees, for communities served by its operations, for an industry that could connect people across distances. Somewhere along the way, Robert lost sight of that vision. He saw the company as an achievement rather than a responsibility. That's what Grandfather wrote in his letter, I said. But I'm struggling to translate that philosophy into practical business decisions while maintaining profitability. Charles smiled. That's exactly the right struggle to have. The question isn't whether to prioritize profit or purpose, it's how to align them so each strengthens the other. James mastered that balance. He believed you have the perspective to rediscover it. My family thinks I'm naive, I admitted, unprepared for the realities of modern business competition. Perhaps, Charles acknowledged. But naivety can sometimes be an advantage when it allows you to question assumptions others take for granted. As for preparation, James didn't choose you because you already knew everything about shipping. He chose you because you possess the character and capabilities to learn what you need to know while maintaining the values essential to the company's true success. He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small notebook. James asked me to give you this when the time was right. It's his personal journal from the early years of building Montgomery Shipping, the challenges he faced, the principles that guided his decisions, the mistakes he made and what he learned from them. I accepted the notebook with trembling hands. Thank you, Charles. This is invaluable. One more thing, he added. James mentioned you might be facing resistance from certain board members. If that's the case, I'd be willing to serve as an interim member during your transition period. I may be retired, but I still maintain relationships with key industry figures who respected James and his approach to business. The offer represented exactly the kind of experienced support I needed. Someone who understood both the industry and Grandfather's vision, who could help navigate board politics without attempting to undermine my authority. I would be grateful for your involvement, I said sincerely. Charles nodded, standing to leave. James was right about you, Olivia. He said you had the rare combination of empathy and backbone essential for meaningful leadership. I'm seeing that combination today. After Charles departed, I remained at the table, turning Grandfather's journal in my hands. Here were his unfiltered thoughts, his private reflections, his personal wisdom about building Montgomery shipping through challenges that must have seemed insurmountable at times. The journal represented not just historical context, but direct mentorship from the person whose faith in me had changed the trajectory of my life. My phone chimed with a message from Margaret. Ethan was spotted at Callahan headquarters this morning. Meeting ran 3 hours. Board Chair Sullivan requesting call with you tomorrow. The momentum of events was accelerating. Challenges were multiplying. Yet, alongside the anxiety these developments triggered, I felt a growing sense of purpose and determination. Grandfather had anticipated these difficulties. He had arranged support systems, Margaret's operational guidance, Charles's board experience, and now this journal containing his hard-won wisdom. I was not facing these challenges alone, but with an invisible network of allies Grandfather had thoughtfully assembled. Moreover, I was discovering resources within myself that had always existed, but rarely been called upon. The capacity to stand firm in my convictions, to navigate conflict without surrendering principles, to recognize manipulative tactics without becoming cynical about human nature. Opening the journal to its first entry, dated June 1962, I began to read. Today I signed the papers to incorporate Montgomery Shipping. Everyone says I'm crazy to leave a secure position to start my own company in this economy. They may be right. But I'd rather fail pursuing something meaningful than succeed at something that doesn't matter. In those words written decades before my birth, I found both inspiration and instruction from the unexpected teacher Grandfather had become. Though no longer physically present, his wisdom continued to guide me through the challenges he had anticipated with remarkable accuracy. The path ahead remained difficult, but I was increasingly confident it was the right path, not just for me, but for the legacy he had entrusted to my care. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.